It will not. Science I love it. Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. When China rules, what will the world be like? Will Beijing govern as a global hegemon or be one among other great powers? Western capitals and their media often warn us about China's rise, though hardly mention the dangers of the West's decline. When China rules, will the world be a safer place? To Crosstalk When China Rules, I'm joined by my guest, James Bradley in New York. He is a New York Times #1 best-selling author, out with his latest book, The China Mirage. In Washington, we have Scott Kennedy. He is the director of the Project on Chinese Business and Political Economy at CSIS. And in London, we cross to Martin McCauley. He is a specialist on international affairs at the University of London. All right, Crosstalk rules. In effect, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. James, if I can go to you in New York first. What will the world be like when China rules?
Well, I don't think China's going to rule, but if Chinese values ruled, I think we'd have a much more peaceful world. Look, we have a big problem in this country with returning wounded warriors, an assembly line of damaged soldiers coming back from our eternal wars. China doesn't have that problem. Maybe American empire, we won't have to keep all those golf courses so green around the world if Chinese values ruled. Education. Scott Walker in my home state of Wisconsin just cut $250 million, $250 million from the University of Wisconsin. That's ridiculous. China's spending billions of dollars on education. Education, respect for elders, more peaceful world with Chinese values, perhaps.
Okay, Scott, if I can go to you in Washington, D.C., what kind of world would China... I mean, I mentioned in my introduction, would it just be a hegemon or just one of many great powers in the world, a more multipolar world? And is that a good idea? Go ahead.
A world run by the Chinese actually isn't going to look a heck of a lot different from the world run by Americans. China has plenty of golf courses, a lot of water that they waste on those golf courses, too. If you just look in economic affairs, China has been the biggest beneficiary from its entry into the WTO and other international economic institutions. And even though it wants a bigger voice in these institutions and other areas, if you ask them what would they say with that voice, they have no idea what they'd say differently from the way the world is run today. And so I really think that you'd end up with some tweaking of a variety of rules, but for the most part, it would just be the faces would look different who's sitting in the chair.
Okay. Martin, if I can go to you. One of the things that is mentioned here was values. James brought it up here. And do you think that a China would replace the United States in terms of policing the world as it does right now? And he mentioned also the body bags that are going home. Is that the Chinese way of doing things? Or would they be forced to do that if they want to be the world's hegemon?
Well, China has talked about the China dream, which means that China will be #1 in the world. So therefore they're thinking ahead, but that's a long way ahead. But if you look at China and the world today, it's still groping around, it's still feeling its way, it's learning. It's a learning curve for them because they're not really involved in solving international problems. They basically stay out. If you look at Iran and Syria and so on, they like to be in the sidelines and they want to be diplomatic and so on, and they pursue mainly economic objectives. So China eventually, if it gains power, world power, it'll be economic power, and the Chinese will impose their views, their economic values on the rest of the world. And politically, if you don't go along with that, then you lose. Because look at the way they've set up the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Yep. It's going to, if you like, do the infrastructure for Asia. They're talking about $8 trillion needed before 2020. Who's going to provide most of that? It'll be China, and they will call the shots. So therefore, if you look at the South China Sea, they've told the Philippines that small nations have to cede to large nations. They take this view, and therefore it'll be a world in which the big boys will in fact dominate. They're not going to dominate in the next 25 years, but China thinks it will dominate in the long term.
Okay. James, if I can go back to you in New York, some of the world's problems in this century was mentioned, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and stuff like that. China really hasn't been much involved in it because it didn't create those problems in the first place. So why would China get involved in those kind of things?
I don't know if China would get involved in toppling regimes like we have, creating all the Middle East problems that we have. We're looking at all the migrants in the Mediterranean. We don't connect that back to us dropping bombs in the Middle East. It's like we threw a big ball in a pool and it's lapping off to the side. When I talked about golf courses, what I meant was military golf courses, American empire surrounding the world. I go to Southeast Asia a lot. You have to be careful where you walk because there's a lot of bombs still on the ground. Even though we were warned about the domino theory, we were supposed to worry about China was going to be some big threats. Those are American bombs that are still there. They weren't made in China.
Okay. Scott, one of the things that, one of the big debates when it comes to China's rise is that does it really want a greater say in the current system, or does it want to create an alternative parallel system? The phrase is the world without the West. Do you think they want the best of both worlds?
I suppose if they could have it that way, why wouldn't anyone want that? I think it's just really hard to imagine an alternative universe where the Chinese dominate, where the U.S. and others aren't very important. And it really depends not just on what the Chinese want, but on how others respond. If you look at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, really, it's not a radical proposal. There's the Asian Development Bank, Latin American Development Bank, a whole variety of these regional multilateral development institutions. And the way the Chinese have set this up with the other 56 members is following along precedent of the other institutions, and it's not going to be run radically different. It's not going to be simply a Chinese cash register for Chinese state-owned enterprises. And so I think if the U.S. and others hadn't taken such a critical view of it, it would just be another one of the ABC institutions that exist right alongside all of the others. So as much as this question is about, what do the Chinese want, really it's going to come down to also what does the U.S., what do others want, how do we respond, and how do we try to integrate the Chinese into existing international institutions, even ones that we admit need a significant amount of reform.
Okay, Martin McCauley, if I can go to you. I mean, but then again, the United States is working on a trade deal in Asia that excludes specifically China, so it doesn't want China to be part of its global trade system. Okay, so we have to point that out. Also, I mean, if you look at these development banks, I mean, I talked to some of the people that are involved in it, and I said, how would you compare it to, like, the IMF? And they'd say no conditionality, where you would push Western foreign policy agendas, privatization, all of these types of things that we're seeing from one country after another. They told me that this bank, the Chinese bank, would not necessarily be involved in that whatsoever. They want a nice rate of return and build infrastructure that will help Chinese enterprises trade all around the world.
Yes, and if you look at the Silk Road and the Maritime Road, which is linking China to Europe by road and rail and by sea, that in fact helps China. Their policy, their foreign policy is in fact commercial normally, because that builds power, because they know that economic power reflects political power. But the Chinese have this great problem that as they become stronger, they will then frighten others, frighten countries like Vietnam and the others, and they will seek protection. They will seek protection from the United States and others. So China at present has to be very careful, because if it seemed to be too aggressive, and if you listen to the speeches of Xi Jinping, he's very self-confident about the role of China, and he visits the world and he shakes hands and so on. And personal diplomacy is very, very important to the Chinese, and they're developing a very powerful soft policy. So China has to be very careful here, because it has to go slowly, and if they go too quickly, if they're too brash and so on, then they will arouse a lot of opposition. So they've got to manage the transition, because they know the future, they believe the future belongs to them. Therefore, they don't have to do it this year or 5 years' time or 10 years' time. They do it in the future.
This is this transition thing that I'm really interested in. James, if I can go to you. People are always talking about China's transition, not to scare the world and all that. But there's also other transitions going on, and that is the relative decline of the West, particularly in some areas like the Middle East, in Asia as well. And this is something that a lot of people worry about, is you have countries like Vietnam or the Philippines or other countries that may have territorial claims, and that they're going to look to the United States, and the United States is going to find itself defending all of these other claims against China. That's containment.
That's containment. I wrote a book, you mentioned it, China Mirage, and the Mirage is this scaremongering coming out mostly out of Washington that we have something horrible to fear about the rise of China. China's not a third world country rising. It's re-emerging. We have a history where China was the dominant, richest country in the world, and that history was relatively peaceful. The West invaded China. China did not build battleships and invade London. It was the other way around. So I'm not too scared about the reemergence of China.
Okay, Scott, how would you look at that? I mean, China had a very, very long history of hegemony, at least in its neighborhood, and it wasn't particularly aggressive. And why should it be seen differently? I mean, if you look at it, I mean, empire doesn't do much for the United States at the end of the day, okay? The Chinese probably will learn that lesson as well. Go ahead. Go ahead. It's hypothetical. Go ahead.
Well, I would just say, I think the way the conversation is going, it sounds like talking points out of the Chinese foreign ministry that we've heard a lot. And I think the reality is that, you know, the Chinese didn't have empire building on the sea, but they certainly had empire building on the land. China's current boundaries aren't the boundaries that it's always had.
Sure.
In addition, you know, the U.S. since World War II has provided peace and stability in East Asia, and that's one of the biggest reasons why China has grown rapidly for such a long period of time. And the presence of U.S. force is still relatively important. If you look at what's going on with Japan and its desire to become quote-unquote normal, without the U.S. there, the likelihood of conflict between China and Japan or China and others would be much more likely.
I have to jump in here. I'm sorry to interrupt. I have to jump in. We have to go to a short break. And after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on China. Stay with our team. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing China's rise on the global stage. Okay, I'd like to go back to James, but first I want to react to what Scott said here. First of all, we're not talking talking points of the Chinese foreign ministry, okay? Most of my talking points come from reading the national interest online. That's where I get most of my information on China. But first, you know, James, I saw you reacting what Scott had to say. Go ahead.
Well, Scott works for CSIS, which was founded by a acolyte of one of Senator Joseph McCarthy's great friends. McCarthyism was based on this fear of China. In 1963, President Kennedy talked about the domino threat from China. He didn't say that he had already green-lighted American bombing of Vietnam, napalming, Agent Orange. I've adopted an Agent Orange girl. This is a result of our aggressive moves. Turns out that the domino theory was just a scare tactic coming out of Washington. This aggressiveness, this aggressive story about China is a very old one coming out of Washington, but it turns out not to be true.
Okay. I mean, Scott, you said about bringing peace and security. I mean, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, I mean, that's hardly peace and stability, okay? Seriously, I mean, I think it's kind of hard to say that. I mean, millions of people in Asia would very much disagree with what you had to say.
Sure. Well,
8 million dead.
Okay,
yes,
let's be fair. Let's go to Scott.
If you wanted to,
go ahead, please do. Please do.
Yeah, so if you wanted a program about the Korean War and the Vietnam War and talk about the 50s and 60s, we could do that. But I thought the program is about looking forward. And if you want to look forward and understand China, where China is going and what the rest of the world should do, then I think we can't be Pollyannish about what that world would look like. As I said, on economic issues, I don't think there's a radical reordering of the world as China gains more influence. It's just the Chinese will have a much larger voice. In security issues, news. It's really interactive effect with a lot of concerns to be raised, not to defend what the U.S. is doing all the time. That would be ridiculous. But there's a lot of interaction, and as you move the pieces around and as you look at what the Chinese are doing in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the cross-strait relationship with Taiwan. These are things for everyone to be worried about, and if we're not careful, the peace and stability that we've had for most of the post-Cold War era, particularly since the 1980s, that would be in danger of slipping away.
Okay, Martin, you know, the famed pivot to Asia from many in China see it as just the containment of China. The U.S. is going to move massive military forces into the Pacific. Again, we have all of its American client states that will turn to Washington if they feel that they need to in some kind of dispute, particularly in the South China Sea. I mean, the Chinese see this as containment, and do you think that they have a rational reason to worry about what the U.S. is doing? Let's turn the coin the other way around.
Well, it is containment. Everyone accepts it to be containment. But you should also remember that the Chinese have laid claim to the South China Sea, an area which is 1.5 times the size of the Mediterranean. And if you look further, they're talking about Hawaii being their natural frontier in the Pacific. And America can go to Hawaii, but stay away from the rest of Pacific. America should not be in that area. And that's the Chinese view. And they're building up a navy, and they're building up cyber warfare capability, and they're building up a military force and so on. So everyone looks at this in the region, and nobody's a match now for China. So therefore it's inevitable that Vietnam, Brunei, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines will look to America to come in. And if you like, it'll be the same as Western Europe after 1948 or 1947, where they feared that the Soviet Union was going to invade. Therefore, America has to come in and provide an umbrella there, because they can't do it themselves. So to go back to what I said originally, it's important for the Chinese to learn diplomacy and to be more diplomatic, and not to stress this point that weak nations have to concede to large nations. They took the Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines, and the United States didn't intervene, but they can't really go much further than that. They're building these islets and so on, and putting aircraft on them. So those who live in the region look at that and say, well, China's expanding and we need to contain China. And this is now going to be a great challenge for China, that it must balance the fears of its neighbors to its own ambitions, and not be too strident and too direct. Okay. Because, as you know, this enmity between China and Japan, and the Japanese think that they have to rearm and protect themselves against China. So we're in a very dangerous situation. I would call that the beginning of the new Cold War.
Okay, well, all right, let me go to James here. Okay, so a new Cold War in Asia here. With respect to Scott, I'm going to just jump in and remember a historical event. You know, it was Japan that invaded China in the last century. It wasn't the other way around. So, James, I mean, again, let's look at this here. I mean, what I worry about is that this very intricate alliance system that the United States has built in the Pacific, and I just worry that one of them is going to be a tripwire where, you know, it's going to be a country like Vietnam or the Philippines are going to force a situation where a military confrontation is inevitable when it shouldn't be.
Yeah, China being strident and aggressive, I agree. They shouldn't be, but this is just completely ignoring American actions. We've dominated that part of the Pacific. It's a long way from our shores. Millions have died from American armaments in Asia because of our projection. Japan is an occupied country, occupied north to south by the American military. We're ruining coral reefs down in Okinawa, expanding our military reach. Guam is about to sink. We're putting so much military equipment pointed at China. Aggressiveness, stridency. We took Diego Garcia, the island, and wiped off the people, shipped them to Africa, and built a base. So, yes, China should tone down things, but we got to put this into perspective in terms of the threats, the historical threats from the U.S. side.
Okay, Scott, do you see that there can be a grand compromise? Because, you know, the U.S. has dominated that region for a long time, since the Second World War specifically, and China is on the rise. Can Washington and Beijing come to some kind of understanding where everybody, you know, to be trite, you know, a win-win situation? Because, you know, both sides building up their militaries, it's not, you know, there's always that August 1914 moment that everybody, you know, it's a nightmare we all want to avoid. Can Beijing and Washington, as Washington, its relative strength in the world declines and China rises, can there be a modus operandi between the two?
Yeah, I agree that would be a wonderful outcome. The domestic politics in both countries aren't pointing in that direction.
Yep.
And China still is far weaker than the United States. And China is a very powerful regional country. It's still not a global power. But obviously the U.S. is going to need some way to figure out how to accommodate Chinese interests more than they've done so far. And the Chinese are going to need to recognize that the United States military isn't going to be withdrawing from Asia. The U.S. has great important interests in the region. And so they're going to have to figure out how to get along with each other. It's not going to be just the United States withdrawing and handing over the keys or the big chair to the Chinese. This is a multi-party dance that has to occur,
yep.
And it's going to require the commitments of multiple parties for this to get done.
Okay, Martin, I think Scott speaks words of wisdom there, but, you know, ever since the end of since the Second World War, and specifically since the end of the Cold War, Washington and its allies around the world aren't interested all that much in compromise. The Iran deal, it may be an exception, but they've gotten used to having their own way, and the Chinese, and I think I agree with Scott a lot there, the domestic politics there doesn't give a lot of wiggle room. You know, China is #1, and it's just returning to its natural place in the world order.
Yes, and the Chinese see the United States as a declining power, they see the European Union as a declining power, and they see themselves as rising. And remember that for in the 1,000 years before 1911, the Han Chinese only ruled the country for about 250 years of that. So therefore they're very, very sensitive about outsiders telling them what to do and how to run things and an outside model and so on. They've had enough of that. They talk about the century of humiliation before 1949, and this is deep in their psyche at present, deep in their culture and so on. So America and the Europeans have to remember that they have to respect the Chinese and regard it as a rising power and give it more wriggle room. As you say, the IMF and World Bank didn't give China the percentage that it thought it should have, so it set up its own bank. Yep. And which will eventually, I think, overtake the IMF and the World Bank. So what China is doing is, if you like, coming into the world and for the first time really feeling that they are proud and they're not being subjected to imperial power by any other large power. They are the one power which is coming through, and this will take some time, and then they have to learn that in the world you have to treat other nations more or less in the same way, with respect and so on.
You know, let me go to James here. Let me go to James before we end the program here. James, do you think that, Martin is correct on many points there, but in the West they don't have the understanding or the knowledge of how China sees the world, and I think that's one of the biggest problems. That's what creates a lot of this conflict. Go ahead, or potential conflict. Excuse me. Go ahead.
For almost 100 years, it was illegal for someone like me to know a Chinese. We had the Chinese Exclusion Acts. They couldn't come to this country. After 1949, we didn't even recognize that China was a country. We said a little rock in the Pacific, Taiwan, was the real China. So, yes, we have to go a long way to understand China. To end on a positive spin, I asked my very wise Dutch friend, Fred, would have China ruled the world? And he said, well, it couldn't be worse than what we have today. So okay. I don't think we have a lot to worry about.
All right, I think that's kind of a neutral point there. Many thanks to my guests in Washington, New York, and in London. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.
I love you.